Shining Force! This is a game that means the absolute world to me. It's a game that I have a great deal of history with, and it was so meaningful to me, I still remember the day I first played it. See, for me, every Friday night, you had a bit of a ritual. You'd go out to the video store and... oh, crap. I might need to explain video stores for the youngins. Okay, so there were these places that were kind of like libraries, except you had to pay to take stuff out. Sometimes, if they were cool, they had games. But they always had VHS tapes, which, oh shoot. Okay, so VHS tapes were kind of a bit like laser discs, except instead of being in disc form, they came in these little black monoliths that, with enough direct exposure, could alter human evolution, and also there might have been a space baby involved. They were roughly the size of a mid-sized sedan, and they are not something I care to ever go back to. And, oh shoot, you might not know what a laserdisc is. And laserdiscs were a bit like 8-tracks, except they had a visual component to them. And if you don't know what an 8-track is, I don't know how to help you anymore. But the point is, you'd go to the video store, and you'd rent a game. One day, I saw 2 games I had never seen there before on their Genesis shelf. Shining Force and Shining Force 2. And I immediately wanted to play these games. They look like really cool fantasy adventures, and that was totally my thing. Unfortunately, my family was broke, and it was lucky I could rent anything, so I only got to rent the first one. I took it to the front counter where the lady behind the counter was about to check me out, and also the game I was renting. But fate would have different plans for me this day, where you see, there was a little game inside a game when you rented games at this video store. See, they had a little gumball machine at the front counter, and before you took out your game, you always got a gumball. It was just part of the ritual, really. And if you happened to get a black gumball, you got a free rental. Well, I rented games there pretty much every week for 20 years, and I only ever got one black gumball. The day I rented Shining Force. And because Shining Force was now a free rental, I ran back and grabbed Shining Force 2. I took them home and played the ever-living crap out of them, and I saw something I had never seen before, something that would affect me for the rest of my life. Later that night, I would sneak out of bed and catch a glimpse of a show that had something very similar that I'd never seen before. That show being Gundam Wing. These 2 games and that one show were my introduction to anime, something that I immersed myself in daily. So it's safe to say Shining Force and its sequel, along with Gundam Wing, are all kind of very important, at least insofar as how much they've affected my life. It was a game of many firsts. It was the first Camelot game I ever played, and I mean, they went on to make some of the best games I've ever played, including Golden Sun, one of the all-time best Game Boy Advance games. It was like the first strategy game I ever played, and if you wanted strategy RPGs on the Genesis, this one game was 1/3 of the library right there. And heck, it was the first game I ever played that had fan service in it, because you could get your mages with their giant robes to get rid of them for a cocktail dress and a bikini, which I totally got for scientific reasons, and I totally just wanted to show this for nostalgia. Yes, that's it. Let's say that. But the point is, Shining Force is an amazing game, and I think everyone should play it if they get a chance. The story to Shining Force is that it is basically the most metal fantasy game ever. Legend has it that 1,000 years ago, evil death metal band Dark Dragon was roaming the land, sharing their music with everyone. Except it was kind of a death clock situation where everything was getting destroyed as they were playing, so they kinda had to get sealed away for 1,000 years. However, a new manager named Dark Soul, so you know he's a good guy, has come to revive them for their next tour. Their first stop on their tour happens to be your hometown. You are a character who can be named whatever you want, but it defaults to Max, a young boy with dreams of becoming a frontman. Except that this game's kind of speciesist and says, hey, you're not a centaur, so you can't be a frontman. You just have to be a bassist for the rest of your life. But he's hopeful, and he's given a shot. In order to try and prevent the groupies of Runefaust, he must form a small team known as Shining Force, who will one day become the greatest glam metal band of all time. After returning home, he sees that it's been destroyed by the evil forces of Dark Dragon. And now, he and Shining Force must hit the road to have the greatest tour of all time, taking it to their enemy's hometown and showing that glam metal is definitively better than death metal in ye olde battle of the bands. Starting with only him, a few groupies, and eventually the daughter of his mentor, Max, will end up creating a glam metal sensation. In all seriousness though, the plot to Shining Force is the standard evil empire controlled by eviler thing and a spunky little rebellion slowly starting to fight back. It's not a terribly complicated plot. There are a few twists and turns in it, and that's okay, but it is a very, very by the numbers and predictable story. But despite the fact that this is about as sort of generic a fantasy plot as you can get, I feel like this game was designed to be the most metal game ever. They for some reason picked the most metal names for everything ever. You're fighting Dark Dragon, your Shining Force, your magical sword of legend you get by the end of the game is called Chaos Breaker. Come on, this game was absolutely about the music. And I mean, heck, if that wasn't enough to tip you off, the sequel stars David Bowie, which is amazing and instantly makes the sequel better, but still, just know that if I could, I'd bedazzle this entire video and give these characters giant 80s hair just to make it feel a little bit more on point. There's a ton of different characters in them, however, they don't really play that much of a role in the story itself. Any character that's a unit really stops having any effect in the story the moment they join you, and they just sort of become a mechanical unit for your team to use. However, I do appreciate how varied the overall cast of characters is. Like, okay, it's a fantasy game, so you're going to expect elves and dwarves, and sure, they're here, but you also have centaurs, and floating octopus creatures, bird people, dragons, some kind of mole thing that spits out rings that turn other things into mole things when they wear them, and what I do believe is a pangolin rocking up in a steam-powered mech. Yeah, Shining Force has a cast of characters from all sorts of different species and walks of life, and I absolutely love that for it. But the game is also kind of weirdly speciesist about things. It's from a mechanical standpoint, but kind of like I said, your character very, very much wants to be a knight. They play that off very, very early, as your character's dream is to be a knight, and everyone in the first town will basically tell you, you're never going to be a knight, and the game mechanically agrees with that. You are a swordsman until you're a hero, and you will never possibly be a knight because all the knights are centaurs. On the flippity flop though, I do kind of appreciate the fact that all the knights are centaurs, because that means that no time or money or resources have to be spent in breeding horses together to give your knights steeds, because they're their own steeds. That's just economical right there. I kind of love the in-universe-ness of that. Like, that just kind of makes sense. When you have people that are horse people, why not make them the actual frontline fighters that charge in on the horses that they already are? That just makes so much sense and saves so many resources for whatever kingdom you're fighting for. Also, I'm just gonna say what we're all thinking. May is Bae. She's rocking the giant 80s hair with headband. She's on the front lines being the best tanky knight in the game. She is basically the front woman of Shining Force, and I love her. She's amazing. The gameplay to Shining Force is, simply put, more or less the Genesis equivalent of Fire Emblem. Although apparently they were not inspired by Fire Emblem in any way. Apparently it was actually inspired by old Japanese PC RPGs. Personally, I find this game a lot more approachable than most Fire Emblem games. I mean, there's no instant permanent death for one thing, which is nice. But for the most part, it's a strategy RPG with heavy anime influences. You start off with a very small team of about 4 or 5 characters, and as you go through the various chapters of the game, you will gain more and more characters, some of which are permanently missable if you don't talk to them at specific points or do certain things. For the most part, it's pretty hard to miss characters though. In my entire playthrough, I missed one character, and it's been forever since I played this game. I was basically going in blind. Each and every one of the characters is relegated to a specific class that is specific to their character, and their class will relegate their default combat role. For example, characters like the knights are sort of all-roundy characters, but because they're all centaurs that have horse legs, they have a greater range of movement than any other character, so they can get from point A to point B substantially faster. Characters like the bird people, they are primarily kind of weaker fighters, but because they can fly, they are not bothered by terrain in any way, shape, or form. The aforementioned pangolin in a steampunk mech suit is like the ultimate tank ever, but because he's in a steampunk mech suit, he can only move 3 or 4 tiles at a time. Various terrain tiles will ultimately dictate how much movement you can do at any one point, or modify exactly how much you can based on your character's initial movement. Certain tiles will also give you defensive options. For example, if you're on a dirt path, you're more likely to be hit than if you're hiding in the forest, which gives you like a 30% dodge rate. These are all small things you need to take into consideration when you approach any form of combat, because you need to strategize exactly what the best way to survive any encounter is. Now, unlike a lot of strategy RPGs, especially modern ones, there isn't really any sort of grind options. Even comparing this to its sequel, there isn't any sort of randomized repeatable battles. This game has exactly 30 combat missions, and that is it. So if you want to level up your characters, you either need to be very, very specific in how you use them in each of the levels, or you need to egress out of those fights and basically repeat them until you've got all the characters leveled up as necessary. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this, as just having a simple repeatable combat training mode or something just to build up some stats to build up your lower level characters would be a lot better, but it's a small thing. While each character's combat role is basically dictated by their class, there is some variation to them just as individual characters. For example, if we just look at the knights, there's like 6 of them in the game, and they're all kind of functionally different. For example, your first knight is Ken, and Ken is pretty crap at everything, honestly. But if you then look at Best Girl May, she is ultimately a very defensive-focused knight, which makes her, like I said, the front woman of the group. She's always leading the charge because, while she's not officially a tank, she's about as close to a tank as knights get. Then you get Arthur, who is absolutely terrible at everything until he's not, and then he's basically the best character ever. And that's because each and every one of these characters, while they all fill out ostensibly the same combat role as dictated by their class, they have individual growth curves that lean them to specific stat bonuses over anything else. Basically, while there's multiple characters that can take up any one particular class in the game, they will still have variation as to what they're going to be more inclined to actually take as a combat role just because of their individual growth curves. It makes them feel unique and like they have their own sort of personality, even if in the story it doesn't really come out so much once they join your party. It at least comes out as who they are on the battlefield, and at least it feels like they are different people, even though they feel fairly similar. But there's still some modification in that. You can find items that are very, very rare, but can increase your stats, and even individual singular points put into different stats can have a huge boost in your actual performance in-game. This isn't really a game about huge stat numbers or anything, so yeah, small increases can have huge results in combat. The other thing that modifies what your character's stats are and their inclinations is leveling. Each character can level up to 20, although once you get to level 10, you can then promote them to another class, although these are entirely linear class paths, so there's no choice in here. You have to get the second game to do that. It's not necessarily wise to level them up right away because their stats kind of have a knock-on effect onto their next class. Now I guess we get to talk about one of the few things I really dislike about this game, and that is leveling is pretty random in the worst way possible. When your character levels up, decided at the moment of leveling, you seem to get just sort of a random stat pull. Normally you get like +1 to 1, maybe 2 stats, but occasionally you get like +5 HP. Oh, and also +3 attack. Oh, and also +4 defense. Oh yeah, sometimes you'll get nothing, which, what's the common parlance I'm looking for here? It's on the tip of my tongue. Oh yeah, that's bad. You could theoretically get an entire character to level all the way to 20 and get like 0 stat points. It's statistically unlikely to be the case, but near as I can tell, there isn't really anything to prevent that from happening. This is kind of a game that really benefits from the fact that I'm running this on an emulator that you can just rewind to get your level up just so that you get optimal stats, because I mean, I've seen some bad level ups in Fire Emblem before, but I've never seen +0 to stats before. This means that your entire level up is effectively wasted. That is monumentally dumb. And while I'm talking about things I don't like, there is one other thing I dislike, and it could just be sort of a bias of mine considering I've played a few other strategy RPGs since this game came out that may have trained me to do otherwise, but when you have a magic using character, when they level up, eventually they gain new spells and they sort of power up the spells they have. And when you upgrade your spells, eventually they'll go from affecting 1 tile to affecting a 5-tile cross. But unless there's an enemy specifically on the panel you want to target, you can't actually hit with it. So if there's 2 characters standing at an angle to one another and you want to hit directly in between both of them with the cross, it won't work. Like, you just can't target an empty space with splash damage and hit both enemies. This is such a small thing, but it really does mess with me, and I dislike this intensely. Now, when you're actually trying to get that experience to make those levels, enemy experience drops seem to be dependent on your level relative to them. So if you're massively above the level of your opponent, you'll get like +2 experience, but if you're below them, you'll get like 48 experience. experience. It's a pretty wide spread, and it's entirely just dictated by how close to a level you are to them. But the nice thing about this is it does act as a barometer to tell you where you are and where your characters are in relativity to where they should be. I kind of appreciate that. However, certain characters such as your healers are substantially harder to level because of it, because they're usually doing 1 or 2 damage. So you'd think that maybe they'd get more experience from healing, but they don't. Healing tends to give them at most 10 experience, which isn't great. And in order to level up my healers, what I had to do was just take my hero, walk over, bop the enemy over the head until they had 1 health, and just have my healers walk over and just finish them off. It's real rough trying to level up your support characters in this game, unfortunately. But other than that, there's really not much to dislike about Shining Force. It's a really well put together strategy RPG that has some great characters and a really brilliant world and some really fun mechanics. For its time, Shining Force I think was pretty impressive. If you were to compare this to, say, Fire Emblem at the time, I think Shining Force is substantially better. I mean, I've only played a little bit of the older Fire Emblems, but those games are really wildly unforgiving, whereas this game is quite the opposite. No character permanently dies because of your own combat errors or because the enemy gets a random lucky critical attack. Yeah, they'll be taken out of your party for a little while and you have to go heal them up, but you know, you can still use them eventually, and it's very rare to permanently miss out on a character. It does happen, mind you, but you kind of have to go out of your way to do it, and you don't lose something if you already have it, which to me makes it a lot more approachable and a lot fairer. And even if you do effectively get a game over, all it does is respawn you back into town right before the fight you were gonna do, and you still get to keep all your experience. So yeah, there's not really a reason to really worry about making the wrong calls here, and you can take advantage of that and grind your characters a little bit anyway. When you're not in combat, you can wander around town and talk to various NPCs. In doing so, you'll find different characters to add to your party, as well as just learn the world around you. You can buy new equipment at various shops, although this does highlight one of the few other issues I have with this game. Every character can hold like 4 items, and that's it, and managing items is just a nightmare to go through all the menus and stuff. There needs to be a better system for just storing items and carrying them between characters, because it is just a mess. It is very, very clumsy, clunky, and slow to try and move items between characters or equip them with anything. It's really bad. If you got a character knocked down, you can go to the church and get them revived for a gold cost that is that character's level times 100 gold, as well as get items uncursed if you have cursed items. There aren't a ton in this game, but they do exist. Oh, also, weirdly enough, there's like a item repair function. I mean, allegedly, it exists in the menu. In my entire playthrough of this game, I didn't have any piece of equipment break, I don't think, so I'm not sure if it actually has any use whatsoever. I guess items might break. I did not experience this though, so maybe I got really lucky, or maybe this was just a dummied out feature or something. I had zero interaction with this button at all. But learning about the various worlds, all the characters, and how all the different political influences affect things is quite interesting. There's this one town you end up going to that's like under enemy occupation, and it has a theater you can go visit, and they have a stage play where you are fighting and losing very, very, very badly to the enemy mooks. And when you finally like thwart the enemy's plans and actually clear them out of the town, they completely flip the script on that play. It's just a small background joke, but it feels like such a cool world building moment. Later on, you go to this town that's just a town of drifters and vagabonds that's literally just a bunch of wagons sort of trained together that exist as a mobile village. There is just so much cool world building in this game, and it does such a great job of showing all the different walks of life and people in it. I think for its time, Shining Force was a pretty ambitious and really well-made game, and I quite enjoy it. I think if you like strategy RPGs and you're looking for it on the Genesis, I mean, it's 1/3 of your options right there, but I don't think it's quite as long and daunting as Warsong ever was, although it's nowhere near as good as Shining Force 2. The overall presentation to Shining Force is tremendously good. Like I said, this is like my intro to anime, and it does not disappoint. The character portraits are really well done. The overworld sprites are bright and vibrant. This game goes with a very colorful palette that works well. The character designs are fantastic. When you go into combat and you initiate a fight, you see this amazing back shot of your character fighting the monsters, and they look really intimidating. And this was actually the first thing that made me realize that Golden Sun was done by the same people, because Golden Sun has sort of the same back shot for its combat scenes. This was how I knew. And the only criticism I have about it is if the enemy attacks you, unfortunately you don't get to see a front shot of your characters. You still see a back shot of of your characters, which I feel like is a missed opportunity. And the visuals greatly enhance the gameplay itself. For one thing, all of the commands are shown on a pictographical cross map, as opposed to like a giant list of commands. So even if you're playing in a language you can't read, you should be able to figure out what each action does just by the visual representation. And because it's in a cross-mapped pad instead of just a standard list, it takes up substantially less visual real estate in the game. This was actually a design idea I incorporated in a couple of games I came up with at one point, just because it seemed like such an innovative and smart way to lay out information. Likewise, I really appreciate that each and every unit has a different visual indicator on the screen. While you're playing the game, each of your units, despite the fact that there's going to be overlap in which specific role they take over, you can tell that, you know, this knight is May, whereas this one is Arthur, whereas this one is Ken. They look visually different on the map, as opposed to, say, Fire Emblem, where every character is simply denoted by their class. Unfortunately, in combat, that kind of gets thrown out the window and all the characters look more or less just like their archetype, which is a bit of a shame, but still, it's nice to see that there is a way to indicate which character is which at a glance. Also, side note, that if you're using magic is ridiculously flashy, so epilepsy warning. I'm not going to show any of that, obviously, because I care that much about you, but just be aware there is some bad flashing lights in this game. Audio-wise, the soundtrack is really, really well done. There's a little jingle for when you add a character to your party, and there's actually variations of it depending on the mood and tone at the time. That just shows how much effort was put into this. What's more, even just a little jingle of reviving your characters at the church is an absolute bop. Like, for whatever reason, the music in this game goes way harder than it has any right to, leading to a tremendous presentation. Now, if you want to copy a Shining Force on the Genesis, cheapest copy I see on eBay right now is about $70, which is definitely a bit pricey. Unfortunately, all Genesis games seem to be going up in price a fair bit, which is definitely unfortunate. It might be nostalgia talking, but I'd still say it's definitely worth it. But again, it is a 30 mission long strategy RPG. Is that worth it to you? For me, absolutely. That said, this isn't exactly the only way to play this. I'm personally playing this right now on the Sega Genesis collection on Steam, and someone was very gracious enough to give me a copy, so big thank you for that. And you can get it there for $1, and I highly recommend you do. Not only is that an incredible deal compared to paying $70, it's the cheapest and most easily affordable way to officially own this game in any capacity at this moment. And unfortunately, Sega's taken that away from us. On December 6, 2024, Sega will be delisting everything on their Steam Genesis collection. That includes Shining Force. It also includes all of their Dreamcast games, and for some reason, Nights into Dreams, which was also the most approachable way to play that game, and that's a personal favorite of mine too. So I am hustling my butt off right now just to make sure this video gets out before this. So if you have any interest in Shining Force, right now go grab it, because very quickly you will not have an official way to properly own this without spending an absolute dump truck worth of money there. But I'm doing everything in my power to make sure you know about this as quickly as I possibly can, so please do if you do have any interest in this. It was also remade for the Game Boy Advance, and apparently it had a couple extra characters and like 3 extra stages. I've not played that, and from what I'm seeing, that's like even more expensive, so yeah, grab the Genesis collection if you can, while you still have a chance. I really wanted to get this video out before Sega delists all that, just so that I could get this message out to all of you. This is an amazing game. It's a huge part of my childhood. It's a very memorable part of my childhood, and I had a blast getting to experience Shining Force yet again. That said, I did actually throw my voice out 3 times while recording this video, because, fun story, I can't actually take my voice out of its standard cadence, or else I completely wreck my vocal cords for like a week. So if I sound froggy throughout all of this, yeah, lost my voice 3 times. Workplace hazard, I guess. Such is the joys of being a mute for most of your life. So I really hope you enjoyed. But because of that, I'm also going to plug my Patreon. I have a Patreon. I make fun things. Please help support me so that I can pay rent. That would be great. Thanks. Love you. But yeah, Shining Force. If you want a cool strategy RPG on the Genesis, this is 30% of your options right there if you don't want to do importing. Is it the best one? Well, Shining Force 2 exists, and I think that game is better, but the fact is, it is still an absolutely impressive game for its time. I think it is doing so many things, and it was very, very ambitious, and as I understand, it was actually on kind of a budget, too. So for all of that, I think they made something really special, and I mean, it's clearly like the most Metal Genesis game of all time. Shining Force. This was a game that helped shape my life, and I'm very glad I got to experience it again.